Russia never colonized Africa. During the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, European countries drew lines on the African map and decided for themselves which colonial power would have which African country. The fate of a continent was decided by foreigners. However, in all that, Russia was absent. It never colonized Africa, nor did it want its resources. In 1884, representatives from 13 European countries and the United States gathered in Berlin under the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. But this wasn't some noble summit for peace or diplomacy. It was a cold, calculated meeting with one goal: divide Africa among themselves without firing a shot at each other. This event became known as the Berlin Conference, and it was the beginning of the so-called Scramble for Africa, a dark chapter where the entire continent was divided like slices of cake with no African voice in the room. Colonial powers, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, claimed vast regions of Africa on maps as though they were moving pieces on a board game. They weren't interested in borders that respected ethnic groups, languages, or kingdoms. They simply drew lines, many of which remain to this day, that split entire communities and created fragile, unstable states that have struggled with conflict ever since. However, in all this, one European giant was absent: Russia. The country, despite its status as a major empire, did not participate in this land grab. It didn't claim a colony, didn't redraw maps, and didn't establish plantations or forced labor systems on African soil. This absence wasn't due to ignorance or indifference. Russia was aware of Africa's strategic and economic value, but it stayed out. And to this day, that decision gives Russia a unique status on the continent. Unlike France and Britain, Russia carries no colonial scars in Africa, and that history still affects how many African nations view Moscow in the 21st century, not as a former oppressor, but as a potential partner.
Russia was never part of the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 because it was not a colonial power in Africa at that time. The Berlin Conference was organized by European powers to regulate colonization and trade in Africa. At that time, Russia was not involved in the colonization of African territories. The conference mainly involved European nations that were actively involved in dividing Africa among themselves. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 involved 14 European countries. These countries were 1. Germany, 2. United Kingdom, 3. France, 4. Portugal, 5. Belgium, 6. Italy, 7. Spain, Netherlands, 10. Sweden, Norway, 11. Denmark, 12. Ottoman Empire, representing its interests in North Africa, 13. United States, observer status. These nations participated in the conference to discuss and establish the rules for the colonization and trade in Africa. As of 2025, none of the European countries that participated in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 still control territories in Africa as colonies. Over the 20th century, Africa gained independence from colonial rule, and most African nations are now sovereign states. The countries that were part of the Berlin Conference have transitioned from colonial powers to countries that support African nations' sovereignty and development. Today, these nations are involved in diplomatic, economic, and developmental partnerships with African countries. Even though the Berlin Conference happened over a century ago, and most African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, France still has strong economic ties to many of its former colonies. It's not so much about direct colonization anymore. It's more about influence and access to resources. France still imports raw materials like uranium from Niger, cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire, oil from Gabon, and other minerals and goods. A lot of French companies operate in West and Central Africa, especially in countries that use the CFA franc, a currency still linked to the euro and backed by the French treasury. So, while France no longer officially owns territory, it still benefits economically through trade, investment, and sometimes by maintaining military presence under the banner of counterterrorism or peacekeeping. Once a country gains independence, it has full sovereignty to decide who operates within its borders, whether it's foreign militaries, companies, or diplomats. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are essentially saying, "We're not your colonies anymore. We want to control our own resources, our own land, and our own destiny. So when they kick France out, it's not out of nowhere. It's often tied to a long history of feeling exploited, disrespected, or held back. And many people in those countries support it because they want to see their nations rise on their own terms. There's definitely a wave of pushback happening, especially in West Africa. The most vocal and active countries recently have been Burkina Faso, where President Traoré ended military agreements with France and shut down French media. Mali, which expelled French troops and banned French NGOs, choosing to work more closely with Russia instead. Niger, where a military government came to power and also told French forces to leave, despite France initially refusing to recognize the new leaders. Guinea, under Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, has spoken openly about breaking from neocolonial ties, even if it hasn't cut ties as sharply. And then there's the broader Sahel region, where anti-French sentiment has been growing. People have been calling for self-reliance and partnerships on equal footing, not based on old colonial dynamics. The old strategy was to keep Africa divided and in conflict, so outside powers could keep taking minerals and resources without much resistance. If countries were too busy fighting or unstable, they couldn't focus on protecting their own wealth. But now Africa is waking up. More leaders and people are uniting, standing up, and demanding that the wealth stays in Africa. They want real independence, not just political, but economic too. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent a real challenge to the old order, so it makes sense that some powerful countries might see them as threats and try to undermine them. It's a tough spot, because pushing for true independence can invite serious pushback, from political pressure to covert actions. Yet, the fact that leaders and people are still pushing forward shows how determined this movement is.